Hey guys, tonight we invite the shadows to lengthen across our study as we turn the pages of history back to an era where justice was not merely a legal concept, but a visceral, physical theater. And we shall examine the one figure who stood at the center of this grim liturgy. A man essential to the machinery of the state, yet utterly rejected by the society he served, the medieval torturer. To understand this figure, we must strip away the Hollywood veneer of the sadistic monster drooling in a dark dungeon and instead look with a scholar's empathetic eye at the profound tragedy of a human being molded by necessity, isolation, and a grim form of civic duty. You see, the life of a torturer did not begin with the inherent predilection for darkness, nor was one simply born with a heart hardened against mercy. For if we look closely at the sociological patterns of the medieval village, we find that the candidate for such a role was often defined not by violence, but by a peculiar, unsettling quietness that marked him from his earliest years. Imagine a child born into the cramped, aromatic reality of a peasant's cottage, surrounded by the scent of damp straw and the biting odor of onions. A child who, unlike his peers, found no joy in the rough-and-tumble games of mock warfare or the boisterous pretense of knighthood, but instead possessed an analytical, almost detached fascination with the biological mechanics of the world around him. While other children chased dogs or played tag, this child might be found in the quiet alleyways behind a bakery, meticulously examining the anatomy of a fallen sparrow or a frog. And not out of a desire to inflict pain, but driven by a need to understand how the joints articulated, how the sinew connected to bone, a curiosity that in a modern era might herald a gifted surgeon, but in the superstitious, faith-drenched atmosphere of the Middle Ages simply made the local priest cross himself and the neighbors whisper of something unnatural. This child was often the son of a butcher or a tanner, someone already living on the periphery of clean society, accustomed to the visceral realities of flesh and blood. Yet he was distinct in his observant silence, a quality that eventually caught the eye of a town magistrate or a steward seeking an apprentice for the darker duties of the law. The recruitment was rarely a choice, but rather a conscription of circumstance. And a day when the boy was led away from the sunlight of the village square to the outskirts where the Uncle Gregor figures of the world resided, those solitary men who lived in houses that the community instinctively shunned. This apprenticeship was not an induction into a cult of cruelty, but a rigorous, almost monastic training in a trade that demanded absolute emotional detachment and a terrifying degree of technical precision. The young apprentice was thrust into a world of sensory deprivation and sensory overload, living in quarters that bordered the subterranean depths, where the architecture itself seemed to conspire against peace, and where he learned that his trade was not about the infliction of pain for pleasure's sake, but about the measured application of stress to the human frame to extract truth, and a concept that medieval theology held in high regard, viewing the confession as a liberation of the soul, even if the body had to be broken to release it. Under the tutelage of his master, the boy learned the pain math of the profession, a grim arithmetic that involved understanding the tensile strength of ropes, the friction of gears, and the precise rotational limits of a human shoulder joint. Knowledge that was imparted with the dry, grunted brevity of a craftsman teaching a novice to shoe a horse or cooper a barrel. He learned that the dungeon was, in essence, a workspace, a room that required meticulous maintenance, where the smell of vinegar and iron permeated the air, and where the tools, often erroneously depicted as exotic machines of doom, were usually simple, practical implements of wood and metal that required oiling, once sharpening and cleaning. The horror of the position lay not in the screaming, which the torturer learned to tune out much like a miller tunes out the roar of the water wheel, but in the profound silence that surrounded his existence outside the dungeon walls. As he grew into his role, donning the heavy leather apron and the thick gloves that would become his second skin, he became a sin-eater for the community, a man who took upon himself the moral stain of violence so that the magistrate, The priest and the merchant could sleep with clean consciences. The gloves were not merely protective gear against the fluids and splinters of his trade, but served as a symbolic barrier between him and the rest of humanity, a sign that he was untouchable, taboo, a figure to be avoided in the marketplace and shunned at the tavern. And the psychological toll of this isolation was immense, for while he was technically a government employee with a steady salary, or at least a sporadic income of coin and confiscated goods, he was socially dead, a ghost walking among the living who could clear a street simply by the sound of his heavy boots on the cobblestones. He lived in a paradoxical state where he was the most feared man in town and yet the most powerless, unable to secure a wife, unable to make friends, and unable to attend the communal feasts and religious festivals that formed the heartbeat of medieval life. The church, which sanctioned his work as a necessary evil for the maintenance of order and the salvation of the accused soul, rarely offered him comfort. And even the priest who stood by during interrogations to record confessions would avoid meeting his gaze once the lantern light of the dungeon was exchanged for the light of day. His domestic life was a study in solitary confinement, often living in a small, damp structure adjacent to the prison, where the acoustics of the stone walls meant that the echoes of his work followed him into his sleep, a constant, low-frequency reminder of the suffering he administered. Yet, amidst this bleak existence, there was a strange, stoic dignity to the professional torturer, a man who viewed himself not as a monster, but as a necessary component of the judicial machine, a specialized artisan who took pride in his ability to distinguish between the amount of pressure required to elicit a truth and the amount that would accidentally grant the release of death, a failure that was professionally embarrassing and financially detrimental. He was a master of pacing, knowing that the threat of pain was often more effective than the pain itself, and he moved through his grim sanctuary with the economy of motion of a chef in a kitchen, cleaning up the aftermath with a bucket and rag, because no one else would descend into that dark to do it for him. As the years wore on, the torturer would age not into a revered elder, but into a forgotten relic, his joints aching from the dampness of the underground, his hands perhaps shaking too much to thread the thumbscrew with his former precision. And eventually, he would simply vanish, perhaps dying in his sleep or wandering off into the anonymity of the wilderness, leaving behind only the heavy iron key and the stained leather apron for the next silent, curious boy who had been chosen to inherit the burden. It is a profound theological irony that this man, who was the instrument of the law and ostensibly the hand of the king's justice, was denied all earthly justice himself, living a life devoid of love, grace, or gratitude, a sacrificial lamb on the altar of medieval order. Now, having understood the solitude of the man in the shadows, we must shift our gaze from the damp darkness of the dungeon to the blinding spectacle of the medieval hall. For medieval society was a tapestry of extreme contrasts, and nowhere was this more evident than in the transition from the private agony of the torture chamber to the public excess of the banquet, a social ritual that was as much a political battlefield as it was a meal. To receive an invitation to a high medieval banquet was not merely a matter of social scheduling, but a high-stakes validation of one's existence within the feudal hierarchy. A signal that one had not been forgotten by the powers that be, for in a world without mass communication, proximity to power was the only currency that mattered. These events were choreographed with a rigidity that would make a modern military parade look disorganized, beginning with the arrival, which was a performance art in itself, where knights and nobles jockeyed to display their status through the splendor of their retinues and the tardiness of their entrance. The great hall, awash in the light of tallow candles and the smoke of the central hearth, was a map of the social universe, with the high table raised on a dais like an altar, separating the sanctified elite from the lower orders who crowded the benches below the salt. Here, the sheer volume of food served, the peacocks redressed in their own feathers, the roasted boars, the endless flow of wine, acted as a display of dominance over the natural world and a projection of the host's resourcefulness. Yet for the guest, The experience was fraught with anxiety. Every bite was monitored. Every conversation was a potential minefield of diplomatic errors. And the seating arrangement itself was a silent judgment, it telling you exactly where you stood in the favor of the Lord. The gluttony was strategic. The intoxication was often weaponized to loosen tongues and reveal secrets, and amidst the jugglers, minstrels, and fire-eaters who provided the entertainment, the real game was the whispering of alliances and the plotting of rivals, making the banquet hall a place where a reputation could be made or destroyed over the course of a single remove. But before we delve deeper into the complex machinations of the feast, we must pause to consider the sheer logistical miracle of the medieval kitchen that powered this spectacle, a hellish, sweltering engine room of sweat and noise that stood in stark contrast to the enforced elegance of the hall above. To fully grasp the magnitude of the medieval feast, one must descend mentally from the dais of the nobility into the inferno that made such splendor possible. For the medieval kitchen was less a culinary workspace and more a chaotic, sweltering foundry where the raw fuel of nature was beaten into the refined currency of social status. If the great hall was a depiction of heaven, ordered and hierarchical, the kitchen was a sensory representation of hell, a windowless, smoke-choked cavern where the heat was a physical weight and the noise a constant roar of shouting voices, clanging iron, and the crackle of fat hitting the fire. Here, an army of invisible laborers, from the master cook, whose authority rivaled that of a minor general, down to the lowly spit boy, whose entire existence was defined by the monotonous, muscle-numbing task of rotating a heavy iron rod for hours on end. He waged a desperate war against time and temperature to ensure that the spectacle above never faltered. The stakes were incredibly high, for a sauce served cold or a roast burned was not merely a culinary error, but a political failure that could result in public humiliation for the host and physical punishment for the staff. This frenetic energy below stairs culminated in the removes, those elaborate waves of dishes that were paraded into the hall not just as sustenance but as edible propaganda, designed to signal the host's reach, wealth, and command over the natural world. We see this in the presentation of the food itself, which often bordered on the surreal. Peacocks carefully skinned, roasted, and then redressed in their iridescent plumage to look alive, or pies filled with live birds that would flutter out upon cutting, in a whimsical display of necro-theatricality that delighted the medieval mind. Yet, for the guests seated according to the rigid geometry of the salt, that invisible line of demarcation where the expensive imported seasoning separated the elite from the expendable, the act of eating was fraught with tension, as one had to navigate the lack of individual utensils, relying on one's own knife and fingers while sharing a trencher of stale bread with a neighbor, a forced intimacy that required a delicate balance of manners and territorial assertion. As the courses progressed, shifting from heavy roasts to lighter, spiced delicacies, the hall became a sensory overload of lute music, the bells of acrobats, and the sharp wit of the jester, and a figure of profound theological significance who served as the only person permitted to speak truth to power, using humor to puncture the inflated egos of the court in a way no bishop or advisor would dare. But the true lubricant of this social machinery was the wine, served not in moderation but in relentless, overflowing waves that transformed the banquet from a formal dinner into a test of endurance and character. The drinking was ritualistic, with toasts to God, the king, and the host serving as mandatory checkpoints that forced every guest to partake, effectively lowering defenses and turning the hall into a psychological minefield where a loose tongue could betray a secret alliance or spark a blood feud before the fruit course arrived. The astute observer would note that the host often watched the consumption carefully, using the flow of alcohol as a tool of espionage, knowing that the truth floats in wine just as surely as spices float in oil. As the night wore on and the veneer of civility began to crack under the weight of intoxication, the banquet hall dissolved into a haze of spilled wine, broken bread, and slumped bodies, leaving the servants to navigate the debris of human excess as dawn approached, sweeping away the physical remnants of a night where fortunes had been gambled and reputations devoured alongside the venison. And yet, if the banquet was the place where the medieval body was stuffed and intoxicated in a public display of power, there existed another institution, equally vital but far more controversial, where the body was stripped, cleansed, and exposed in a communal vulnerability: the public bathhouse. And contrary to the persistent myth of the filthy Middle Ages, the medieval urbanite was not allergic to water. In fact, they inherited a robust bathing culture from the Romans, and in cities across Europe, the bathhouse stood as a pillar of civic life, a cathedral of the flesh, where the grime of the streets and the smoke of the hearth could be washed away. These establishments were often surprisingly sophisticated, utilizing complex heating systems to pipe hot water into wooden tubs or stone pools, creating a steamy, herbal-scented sanctuary that offered a rare escape from the harsh elements of the outside world. But the bathhouse was never just about hygiene. It was a social condenser, a place where the strict hierarchies of the street were softened by the removal of clothing, that great marker of status. In the steam-filled rooms, the merchants, artisans, and even clergy would mingle, their nakedness serving as a temporary equalizer that allowed for a different kind of discourse, one that was intimate, unguarded, and ripe for both business and gossip. The atmosphere was one of sensory indulgence, where one could be scrubbed by an attendant, shaved and massaged, reclaiming a sense of dignity and physical well-being that was often eroded by the brutal conditions of medieval labor. More than just a spa, the bathhouse was often a place of dining, a detail that delights the modern imagination, where wooden boards were floated across the water laden with wine, cheese, and meats, allowing patrons to feast while submerged, blending the pleasures of the palate with the comforts of the bath in a way that seems almost decadent to our puritanical sensibilities. However, this commingling of flesh, food, and wine inevitably drew the ire of the moral guardians of the day, for the church viewed the bathhouse with deep suspicion, seeing in the steam and nudity not a celebration of God's creation, but a slippery slope toward lust and vice. Indeed, the line between a legitimate bathhouse and a brothel was frequently blurred, and the stews, as they were sometimes called, became synonymous with illicit liaisons, prompting a constant tug-of-war between the civic need for cleanliness and the ecclesiastical demand for purity. This tension came to a tragic head with the arrival of the Great Plagues, particularly the Black Death, which transformed the bathhouse from a sanctuary of health into a perceived vector of death. The medical wisdom of the time, tragically grasping at straws, began to theorize that hot water opened the pores and allowed the miasma, or pestilence, to enter the body, a belief that led to the gradual shuttering of these communal spaces. As the doors of the bathhouses closed and the fires under the cauldrons died out, Europe entered a period of olfactory darkness where the dry wash with linen cloths replaced the soak, and the communal intimacy of the tub was lost, replaced by a fear of water that would persist for centuries. Thus, we see the medieval world not as a static painting of dirt and darkness, but as a dynamic struggle between the desire for connection, whether through the shared bread of the feast or the shared water of the bath, and the ever-present threats of disease, judgment, and social collapse. This drive for connection, however, it was not limited to the local town square or the castle hall. It stretched across the horizon, reaching out to the very edges of the known world through a network of dust and determination that we now call the Silk Road. Before it was a name in a history book, it was a terrifying reality for those who dared to traverse it, a fragile artery of commerce that pulsed through the most inhospitable terrains on earth, linking the dragon throne of China with the marble halls of Rome not by a single paved highway, but by a shifting web of caravan tracks etched into the Gobi Desert and the freezing passes of the Pamir Mountains. To understand the Silk Road is to understand the supreme power of human desire, the desire for the exotic and for the other, for the silk that shimmered like woven water and the spices that could disguise the taste of decaying meat, a desire so potent that men were willing to risk dehydration, banditry, and death to fulfill it. The journey began in the cosmopolitan bustle of Chang'an, where the air was thick with the smell of roasting meats and the polyglot chatter of 1,000 nations, and it ended, months or years later, in the markets of the Mediterranean. But the space in between was a test of the human spirit. The trader did not simply walk. He submitted himself to the rhythm of the camel, that grumpy, indomitable beast of burden, without which global trade would have been impossible, enduring days of blinding sun where the only landmark was the bleached skeleton of a predecessor who had lost the way. These caravans were mobile cities, heavily armed and strictly organized, moving from oasis to oasis like sailors hopping between islands in a vast ocean of sand, for the oasis was more than a water source. It was a cultural decompression chamber, a port in the desert where the intense isolation of the trail gave way to the vibrant chaos of the caravanserai. In these fortified inns, the air was thick with the smoke of dung fires and the sounds of a dozen languages, Sogdian, Persian, Arabic, Chinese, merging into a pidgin tongue of trade, where a bolt of silk might be bartered for a bag of silver coins, a crate of glass, or a new religion. Indeed, the most significant cargo carried along these routes was not material, but metaphysical. Buddhism traveled the Silk Road from India to China, transforming as it went, was absorbing local deities and artistic styles until it became the distinct Mahayana tradition of the East, while Islam later flowed westward and northward, carried not just by the sword, but by the ledger of the merchant who brought his faith alongside his fabric. Ideas, stories, and technologies, paper, gunpowder, the compass, leaked across borders that were supposed to be impermeable, proving that while empires might build walls, the merchant will always find a gate, for profit is a universal solvent that dissolves political barriers. Yet we must not romanticize this exchange, for the same road that brought civilization also brought the apocalypse in the form of the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which hitched a ride on the fleas of the rats that nestled in the saddlebags of the caravans, moving relentlessly westward to decimate the populations of Europe and change the course of theology and labor forever. The Silk Road was thus a conduit of both life and death, a testament to the fact that globalization is not a modern phenomenon, but an ancient human instinct, a realization that we have always been bound together, for better or worse, by the threads of commerce and curiosity that stretch across the wasteland. Tonight we leave the damp, echoing stone of the European dungeon and the steam-choked intimacy of the bathhouse to step onto a stage so vast that it swallows armies and empires without a belch. The Silk Road. To call it a road is a deception of language, a simplification that betrays the terrified, exhausted reality of those who walked it. For there was no single paved highway stretching from the Jade Gate of China to the ports of the Mediterranean, but rather a shifting, treacherous network of faint trails, dusty arteries, and mountain passes that snaked through the most hostile geography on God's earth. It was a route carved not by surveyors, but by the hoofprints of millions of beasts and the desperate ambition of merchants who looked at the horizon, saw a burning void, and decided to walk into it anyway. We must begin our examination not with the silk, but with the engine that made it possible, the biological miracle without which globalization would have died in its cradle. The Bactrian camel. If the horse was the fighter jet of the ancient world, the camel was its cargo ship, a creature designed by evolution, or perhaps a humorous creator, to survive the apocalypse. These were not the sleek dromedaries of the Arabian sands, but the shaggy, two-humped giants of the steppes, creatures of foul temper and infinite endurance, capable of carrying 500 pounds of merchandise while navigating terrain that would break a wagon wheel in an hour. To the merchant, the camel was not a pet, but a lifeline. Its ability to drink 30 gallons of water in minutes and then march for days without a sip was the only mathematics that mattered in the Taklamakan Desert, a place whose name literally translates to the place of no return. Imagine the sensory reality of the caravan, a serpentine procession of beasts stretching for miles, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, dung, and the sweat of men who hadn't bathed in weeks, moving to the rhythmic clanging of the copper bells hung around the camels' necks. Not for music, but to ensure that in the blinding fury of a sandstorm, the tail of the caravan could still find the head. The life of a caravaneer was a monastic existence devoted to the god of profit, a daily liturgy of waking before dawn to beat the killing heat, loading screaming animals in the blue-black cold of the desert night, and trudging through a landscape so alien that medieval travelers frequently reported hearing the voices of demons calling their names from the dunes, a phenomenon we now know to be the acoustic trickery of shifting sands, but which to them was the very real whisper of hell. Security was an obsession, for the Silk Road was a magnet for the desperate and the violent. A caravan was essentially a moving vault of gold, spice, and silk, and thus it required a private army to protect it. Merchants hired mercenaries, hardened Sogdian archers or Turkic riders who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder, turning the caravan into a mobile fortress that was part bazaar, part military unit. Yet the greatest enemy was not the bandit with a sword, but the environment itself. In the high passes of the Pamirs, altitude sickness could drown a man in his own fluids, while in the Gobi, the heat could cook a brain in the skull. It was a test of the human frame that required a theological level of faith, not necessarily in a divine being, but in the promise that somewhere, months ahead, there was a market that would make the suffering worth it. And when salvation came, it did not look like a city of gold, but it looked like a muddy watering hole surrounded by date palms, the oasis. These were the punctuation marks in the sentence of the journey, the vital lungs of the trade network. Towns like Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Samarkand were not merely rest stops. They were the first true cosmopolises of the ancient world, melting pots where the DNA of civilizations twisted together. At the center of this oasis, life stood the caravanserai, a structure that deserves to be studied with the same reverence we apply to the cathedral. Architecturally, it was a fortress of commerce, a rectangular complex with high, windowless walls designed to repel raiders and a single, massive gate that locked at sundown. Inside, however, it was a chaotic sanctuary. The ground floor was a stable for the beasts, a noisy, stinking mosh pit of camels, horses, and mules, while the upper galleries housed the merchants in small cell-like rooms. Stepping into a caravanserai at dusk was to step into the sensory overload of the known world. You would hear the guttural prayers of Zoroastrians mixing with the sutras of Buddhist monks and the accounting disputes of Jewish merchants, all spoken over the bubbling of cooking pots and the smell of roasting mutton. It was here, in the safety of these stone walls, that the relay nature of the Silk Road became apparent. We often romanticize the idea of a single traveler walking from Rome to China like Marco Polo, but this was the exception, not the rule. The Silk Road operated on a handshake basis of short-haul trucking. A Chinese merchant might carry his silk only as far as the oasis of Turfan, where he would sell it to a Sogdian middleman, who would carry it across the mountains to Samarkand, where it would be bought by a Persian, who would transport it to Baghdad. By the time a bolt of silk reached the shoulders of a Byzantine empress, it had changed hands a dozen times, gaining value and mystery with every transaction, its origins dissolving into legend. This economic friction is what built the great cities of Central Asia, turning them into beacons of wealth and art that rivaled anything in Europe. But the trade was not limited to luxury goods. The caravan carried the bizarre and the mundane with equal care. Yes, there was silk, light as a cloud and strong as steel, and there were spices that could mask the taste of rotting meat, but there were also ostrich eggs, ivory, glass from Syria that the Chinese found baffled by. Eels and even lions and leopards caged and carted thousands of miles to satisfy the curiosity of distant emperors. It was a highway of desire, where the exotic was simply a commodity that hadn't arrived yet. However, we must not let the glitter of gold blind us to the darker commodities that moved along these trails, for the Silk Road was also a pipeline of human misery. Slaves were a standard currency. Men and women trafficked like cattle from the steppes to the harems and labor camps of the Middle East and China, their individual tragedies lost in the grand sweep of commerce. And alongside the humans and the animals walked the invisible hitchhikers, the microbes and ideas that would change the world more than any bolt of cloth. The caravanserai was an incubator for theology. It was there that the Buddhist monk shared his fire with the Manichaean priest, and where the Nestorian Christian debated the nature of the Trinity with the Islamic scholar. These late-night conversations, fueled by wine and exhaustion, allowed religions to bleed into one another, creating a syncretic tapestry of faith where Jesus could be depicted as a bodhisattva and Buddha could be revered as a prophet. This was the true miracle of the road. It forced the world to look in the mirror and realize it was not alone. The isolation of the village was shattered by the arrival of the caravan, bringing with it not just peppercorns, but the terrifying and exhilarating realization that there were other ways to live, other gods to worship, and other kings to fear. It was a globalization of the mind, occurring at the speed of a camel's gait, and a slow, relentless weaving of the human story that would eventually pull the disparate threads of the world into a single, tangled knot. To walk the Silk Road was to engage in a gamble where the house, in this case, the unforgiving geography of Eurasia, almost always won, for while we have spoken of the romance of the trade, we must now turn our eyes to the teeth of the journey, to the terrifying reality that this artery of wealth was also a corridor of blood. The desert did not forgive ignorance, and it certainly did not respect profit margins. Beyond the safety of the oasis walls, the merchant entered a realm where the social contract evaporated, replaced by the primal law of the predator. Bandits were not merely ragged thieves engaging in opportunistic muggings. They were organized. Paramilitary syndicates often operating with the tacit approval of local warlords or corrupt officials, utilizing spies within the caravanserais to identify which camel train carried jade and which carried only grain. An ambush in the desolate stretches of the Taklamakan was swift and total, a sudden eruption of violence where arrows flew from the dunes and the screams of dying men were swallowed instantly by the vast, indifferent silence of the sands, leaving survivors stripped naked and abandoned to the elements, a fate often crueler than the blade. Yet, even the cruelty of man paled in comparison to the wrath of the earth itself, for the Silk Road traversed some of the most meteorologically violent regions on the planet. The sandstorm, or black wind, was a demonic force that could darken the sky at noon, burying an entire caravan alive in minutes, erasing the path so completely that later travelers would find no trace of those who had vanished, save for the occasional bone resurfacing years later, like a piece of driftwood. In the high passes, the threat shifted from heat to the crushing weight of snow and the thinning air, which could stop a heart or freeze a limb before the traveler even realized they were dying. It is a testament to the sheer magnetic pull of wealth that men continued to step into this meat grinder of nature, convinced that the shimmer of silk was worth the risk of their souls. But the most devastating threat on the Silk Road did not carry a sword or howl in the wind. It was microscopic, a silent, invisible stowaway that would eventually bring the medieval world to its knees and shake the foundations of theology itself. And we speak, of course, of the pestilence. It is a grim irony of history that the same global network that allowed for the flourishing of art, the exchange of philosophy, and the enrichment of kings was also the perfect delivery system for Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. The plague did not travel on the wind. It traveled in the saddlebags of the merchant, on the backs of the rats that scurried through the grain stores, and in the very fabric of the trade that bound east to west. The Silk Road acted as a biological superhighway, allowing a pathogen from the steppes of Central Asia to bypass natural geographic barriers and unleash a biological apocalypse upon the densely populated, unsuspecting cities of Europe and the Middle East. When the Black Death arrived, it did not negotiate. It decimated, and it turned the bustling caravanserais into tombs and the vibrant trade hubs into ghost towns, creating a crisis of faith where priests and imams alike struggled to explain why God would allow such indiscriminate slaughter. The plague highlighted the double-edged sword of connection. We are stronger when we are linked, yes, but we are also more vulnerable, for the walls we tear down to let in the gold also let in the contagion. In the shadow of this devastation, however, we must pause to illuminate another group of figures who have been systematically erased from the chronicles of the Silk Road, obscured by the dazzle of emperors and the swagger of male explorers: the women. The popular imagination paints the Silk Road as a strictly masculine domain of bearded merchants and rugged warriors. But this is a historical falsehood. Women were the silent engine of this entire economy. Who, after all, produced the silk? It was the women of China, millions of them, who tended the silkworms, boiled the cocoons, and spent their lives hunched over looms, their fingers weaving the very currency that drove the world's economy. Without their labor, the Silk Road would have been a road to nowhere. But their role was not limited to production. In the nomadic cultures of the steppe, women wielded immense power, often managing the herds, conducting trade, and even riding alongside the men as equals in a way that shocked the more sedentary, patriarchal societies of Europe and China. We find records of formidable noblewomen whose marriages were not just unions of flesh, but diplomatic treaties that secured trade routes. Nay, women who traveled thousands of miles in dowry caravans to marry foreign khans, acting as living bridges between cultures. In the oasis towns, it was often women who ran the hostels and the tea houses, managing the logistics of the trade while the men were on the trail, serving as the keepers of local knowledge and the brokers of secrets. Yet we must also acknowledge the dark shadow of trafficking. For women were also commodities on this road, enslaved and transported like livestock to fill the harems and households of the wealthy, their names lost to history, their voices silenced by the sheer scale of the exploitation. As we look at the tapestry of the Silk Road, we see that it was woven with threads of gold and threads of sorrow, a complex human endeavor that defied the simple binaries of East and West, good and evil. And it was a place where a princess could change the course of an empire with a word, and where a slave could die nameless in the dust, both of them integral parts of the same vast breathing machine. But as with all things under the sun, the glory of the Silk Road was destined to fade, not because the desire for connection died, but because the world shifted on its axis. By the 16th century, the great overland routes began to quiet, the dust settling on trails that had once thrummed with the heartbeat of the world. The rise of the maritime powers, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, meant that a ship could carry in one hold what 1,000 camels could barely haul, and could do so faster, cheaper, and without paying tribute to a dozen different khans along the way. The ocean became the new Silk Road, and the great desert cities, and once the lighthouses of civilization, began their slow, melancholy slide into obscurity. Political instability, the fragmentation of the Mongol peace, and a rising tide of religious conservatism that viewed foreign trade with suspicion further strangled the flow of goods. The world turned its face toward the sea, and the desert was left to the ghosts and the wind. Yet the road never truly died. It merely went dormant, sinking into the subconscious of the human race. Its legacy is written in the DNA of our modern world, in the food we eat, the words we speak, and the very way we conceptualize the globe. The Silk Road taught us that we are not islands. It proved that despite our walls, our languages, and our gods, we are bound together by an insatiable curiosity and a desperate need for what the other possesses. And it was the first draft of the Internet, the first experiment in globalization, a glorious, bloody, terrifying proof that the human spirit refuses to be contained by geography. And so, as we stand at the end of this journey, looking back at the torturer in his dungeon, the lord at his feast, the bather in the steam, and the merchant on the dune, we see not a collection of dusty facts, but the enduring struggle of our species to find meaning, pleasure, and connection in a world that is often cruel and always changing. As the medieval era began to wane, giving way to the tumultuous birth of the early modern world, a profound silence descended upon the institutions we have explored, a silence not of peace, but of abandonment and transformation. We must understand that the death of the Middle Ages was not merely a change in dates or dynasties, but a fundamental shift in how humanity perceived the physical world and its place within it. Consider the fate of the bathhouse, once the steaming, chaotic heart of the city. Its decline was not simply a matter of medical ignorance, the fear that hot water opened the pores to the plague, but a symptom of a deeper theological and social contraction. As the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation swept across Europe, the body, which had been celebrated in the bathhouse as a vessel of community and pleasure, came to be viewed with a new puritanical suspicion. The nakedness that had been a social equalizer in the tub became a mark of shame in the pulpit. The floating trays of wine and the easy camaraderie of the steam room were reinterpreted not as simple joys, but as the anterooms of hell. Authorities, driven by a blend of sanitary terror and moral panic, boarded up the doors of these establishments, draining the pools and letting the copper cauldrons rust. The result was a Europe that grew colder and dirtier, a society that retreated from the communal vulnerability of the water into the stiff, starched collars of the Renaissance, replacing the washcloth with the perfume bottle to mask the scent of a humanity that had forgotten how to touch one another. This great drying of the West paralleled the great silencing of the Silk Road. Just as the bathhouse was boarded up, so too were the gates of the great caravan cities. When the Portuguese and Spanish carracks began to brave the oceans, mastering the winds that would carry them to the Spice Islands, the economic lifeblood was drained from the desert. The great land routes, and which had demanded so much human sacrifice and cooperation, were rendered obsolete by the ruthlessly efficient mathematics of maritime trade. The caravanserai, once the parliament of the world, fell into ruin, its walls crumbling into the sand, its courtyards no longer echoing with the babel of 100 tongues but whistling with the lonely wind of the steppe. The decline of the Silk Road was a tragedy of disconnection, where once a merchant had to look a stranger in the eye, share his fire, and understand his gods to do business. The new age of sail allowed empires to trade and conquer. From the detached distance of a ship's deck, the world became larger in scope but smaller in spirit, trading the slow, intimate cultural osmosis of the caravan for the rapid, extractive transaction of the port. And what of our silent friend, the torturer, in this shifting landscape? As the medieval world faded, so too did the peculiar, ritualistic intimacy of his profession. The Middle Ages, for all its brutality, had viewed torture as a grim species of dialogue, a spiritual threshing floor where the truth was separated from the lie through an ordeal of pain. But as legal systems evolved and the bureaucracy of the state grew more impersonal, the torturer lost his role as the dark priest of justice and became merely a technician of the state, a cog in a machine that would eventually industrialize cruelty in ways the medieval mind could scarcely imagine. The dungeon, once a place of specific, localized horror, would eventually give way to the penitentiary, transforming the punishment of the body into the punishment of the soul through time and isolation. Yet, the legacy of these figures, the torturer, the feasting lord, the bather, and the merchant, remains etched into the bedrock of our collective memory. We look back at the banquet not just as a display of gluttony, but as a desperate assertion of life in the face of death. A memento mori with roasted peacock, where men and women feasted with a ferocity born of the knowledge that the plague might take them by morning. We look at the bathhouse and see a lost golden age of social trust, where the community dared to be vulnerable together. And we look at the Silk Road and see the enduring truth that the human spirit is fundamentally nomadic, driven by a hunger that no border can contain. These were not merely historical curiosities. They were the architectural expressions of human longing, the longing for order, for pleasure, for purity, and for connection. The ruins of the caravanserai and the empty foundations of the bathhouse are not gravestones. They are monuments to the audacity of a species that, even in the darkest of times, sought to build bridges across the silence, whether that silence was the emptiness of the desert or the distance between two human hearts. In this twilight of the medieval world, we see the seeds of our own, the tension between globalization and isolation, between the celebration of the body and the fear of it, and the eternal, dangerous quest for the truth, no matter the cost. If we stand quiet enough in the ruins of history, we begin to realize that the past is not a foreign country, but merely a reflection of ourselves, seen through a glass, darkly. We have walked through the damp corridors of the dungeon, sat at the high table of the feast, and soaked in the steam of the bathhouse, and trudged across the burning sands of the Silk Road, and in each of these places we find not just the artifacts of a dead age, but the eternal contours of the human condition. It is a mistake to view the medieval era as a nightmare from which we have happily awakened. Rather, it was a crucible in which the fundamental desires and fears of our species were played out in their rawest, most unvarnished forms. Consider the torturer, that solitary figure in the leather apron. We may have abolished the rack and the thumbscrew, banished the Iron Maiden to the Museum of Macabre Curiosities. But have we truly exorcised the shadow he represents? The torturer was the embodiment of the state's desire for absolute truth and absolute control, in a desire that has not vanished but merely shifted from the physical to the digital, from the breaking of bones to the mining of data. The pain math of the dungeon has been replaced by the cold algorithms of surveillance, yet the underlying logic remains. That the individual must be made transparent, stripped of secrets for the greater good of the order. The torturer's isolation, too, finds its echo in the modern world, in the way we still ostracize those who perform the necessary but unclean tasks of society. The undertakers, the waste managers, the unseen laborers who keep the machinery of civilization running while we avert our gaze. We are not so different from the medieval villager who crossed the street to avoid the executioner. We simply have more polite ways of drawing the circle of exclusion. And what of the banquet? And the peacocks may no longer be served in their feathers, and the jesters may have been replaced by pundits and influencers, but the theater of the meal remains the primary stage for our social anxieties. We still use food as a weapon of status. We still navigate the treacherous geography of the seating chart, and we still perform the ritual of consumption to prove that we have conquered the scarcity of nature. The medieval lord displaying a castle made of sugar was driven by the same impulse that drives the modern billionaire to display a yacht or a rocket, the desperate need to shout, "I exist and I matter," into the void of history. The excess of the medieval feast was a rage against the dying of the light, a caloric fortification against the fragility of life, and in our own age of consumption, we are still feasting. They're still drinking the wine of distraction, hoping to drown out the silence that waits at the end of the party. The form changes, the menu evolves, but the hunger for validation, for power, for immortality, remains as insatiable as it was when the first boar was roasted on a spit. Then there is the silence of the bathhouse, perhaps the greatest loss of all. We have traded the communal tub for the private shower, gaining hygiene but losing a vital form of humanity. The medieval bathhouse forced people to confront one another without the armor of cloth and rank. It was a place of radical equality where the banker and the baker sweated side by side. By retreating into our private sanitariums, we have sanitized our lives of the messiness of community. We are cleaner, yes, but we are also lonelier, scrubbing away not just the dirt, but the tactile connection that binds a society together. The miasma theory that closed the bathhouses, the fear that the air of the other was poisonous, has strangely resurrected itself in our modern fear of the stranger, in the walls we build to keep our own air pure. And finally, the Silk Road, that great ribbon of dust, reminds us that isolation is, and always has been, an illusion. We are a species that cannot sit still. The camel caravans have been replaced by fiber-optic cables, the caravanserai by the server farm, but the trade continues. We are still swapping silk for silver, ideas for insults, and prayers for profits. The lesson of the Silk Road is that the walls we build are permeable, that the mountains can be crossed, and that whether we bring gifts or plagues, and we are destined to meet one another. The spirit of the road does not reside in the goods carried, but in the carrying itself, in the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal of the human animal to remain alone in the dark. To fully comprehend the world we have journeyed through, from the scream in the dark to the laughter in the steam, we must peel back one final layer. We must understand not just what these people did, but how they felt the reality of their own existence. For the medieval mind, the physical body was not merely a biological machine, it was a battleground, a theological map where the wars between sin and salvation, order and chaos, were fought daily. When we look at the torturer, we must realize that in the eyes of his contemporaries he was not simply extracting information. So he was engaged in a grim form of surgery on the soul. The body of the accused was seen as a cage of deceit, a fortress of lies that had to be breached so that the truth, which was divine, could escape. The pain was the key that unlocked the jaw. The scream was the sound of the devil leaving the vessel. This is why the torturer's role was so heavy with paradox. He was a destroyer of the flesh, yes, but he was also believed to be a liberator of the truth, performing a duty that, while repulsive, was seen as necessary for the spiritual hygiene of the community. He broke the vessel to save the contents, a horrific logic that made perfect sense in a world terrified of the hidden sins of the heart. Shift your gaze then to the banquet hall, and you see the body transformed from a cage into a billboard. In a society with low literacy, power had to be visual, and it had to be visceral. The Lord did not just possess wealth, he ingested it. The act of eating was a public performance of dominance over the natural world. To consume a swan, a creature of beauty and grace, was to consume its essence, to show that one's authority extended to the very birds of the air. The removes of the feast were not just courses of food, they were chapters in a sermon about hierarchy. The body of the noble, stuffed with spices from the Silk Road and wine from the royal vineyards, became a physical manifestation of the state itself, large, expansive, and consuming. The peasant, watching from the shadows or eating the stale trenchers at the gate, understood this visceral theology. The Lord is the mouth that eats, and we are the hands that feed. And the hierarchy of the cosmos was written in gravy and bone. And what of the bathhouse? Here the theology of the flesh became most dangerous. In the tub, the medieval person stripped away the costumes of class, the wool of the peasant, the velvet of the merchant, the linen of the priest, and returned briefly to the state of Adam and Eve. This was the source of the Church's deep anxiety. It was not just the sex, it was the equality. In the steam, the body was just a body, vulnerable and human, divorced from the rigid social structure that God had supposedly ordained. The bathhouse was a temporary Eden, a place of pleasure and purity, but in a fallen world, Eden is always suspect. To cleanse the body was good, but to enjoy it too much was to forget that the body was dust. And the bathhouse walker balanced on a razor's edge between the virtue of cleanliness and the vice of vanity, washing away the dirt of the world while trying not to stain the soul with lust. It was a tension that could never be fully resolved, only managed with herbs, prayer, and the occasional nervous glance at the heavens. Finally, consider the traveler on the Silk Road. To them, the body was neither a cage nor a billboard, but an instrument of endurance. The merchant on the camel was a pilgrim of profit, testing the limits of what the human frame could withstand in pursuit of the horizon. Every blister, every shiver in the mountain pass, every parched gasp in the desert was a testament to the will. The Silk Road proved that the body could be pushed beyond the boundaries of the known world, and that it could survive the alien landscapes and the foreign stars. But it also carried the ultimate reminder of mortality. The bones bleaching in the Gobi were not just markers of a failed journey. They were sermons in calcium, preaching the fragility of man against the enormity of creation. The traveler walked with death on one shoulder and ambition on the other, proving that the human spirit is an alchemy of fear and greed, fragile flesh and iron will. Thus, whether under the hand of the torturer, at the table of the Lord, in the water of the bath, or on the back of a camel, the medieval body was the central character in a drama of profound stakes, a vessel carrying the weight of an entire world view.